Welcome to the Evidence Locker. I'm your host, and today, for our Solved Saturday segment, we are stepping back into the jazz age of Los Angeles, a city of palm trees, silent film glamour, and a booming economy that seemed untouchable. But in December 1927, that facade of prosperity was shattered by a crime so depraved it was dubbed the most horrible crime of the 1920s. This is the story of Marion Parker. It is a case marked by chilling deception, a massive breakdown in school safety, and a series of catastrophic failures in the ransom process that turned a kidnapping into a waking nightmare. We will deep dive into the investigation, the psychological warfare of a killer known as the Fox, and a legendary manhunt that changed American forensics forever. The morning of December 15th, 1927, was a classic Los Angeles winter day. Bright, crisp, and deceptively peaceful. For Perry Parker, an assistant cashier at the Los Angeles First National Bank, it was supposed to be a day of celebration. It was his 48th birthday. He likely left for work that morning with the typical domestic sounds of a bustling household. His wife Geraldine organizing the day, and his 12-year-old twin daughters, Marion and Marjorie, preparing for their classes at Mount Vernon Junior High. Mount Vernon sat in the affluent Lafayette Square neighborhood, a place where parents felt their children were shielded from the grit of the city. The school was a hum of activity, the scuffle of leather shoes on waxed floors, the rhythmic scratching of fountain pens, and the muffled voices of teachers. Behind the front desk of the main office sat Mary Holt. Her job was one of order and bureaucracy, but at approximately 11 a.m., that order was interrupted by the chime of the front door. A young man stepped inside. He didn't look like a threat. In fact, he looked like he belonged in the very bank where Perry Parker worked. He was well-dressed, neatly groomed, and carried himself with an air of urgent professionalism. This was William Edward Hickman, though at that moment he was merely a messenger. He approached Mary Holt's desk with a look of practiced distress. He told her he was an employee of the First National Bank, a colleague of Perry Parker. Then he delivered the blow that every parent and educator fears. He claimed that Perry had been involved in a horrific automobile accident, a quote, smash-up, and was lying in a hospital, clinging to life. He said Perry was calling out for his daughter. Mary Holt felt the immediate weight of the situation, but a small detail gave her pause. She knew the Parker family. She knew there wasn't just one daughter at Mount Vernon. "Which daughter do you mean?" she asked. "Mr. Parker has twins." This was the moment the entire tragedy could have been averted. Hickman, for all his planning, had been momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't realized there were two girls, but he was a master of the big lie. He didn't stammer. He didn't look away. He simply adjusted his story on the fly. "He wants the younger one," Hickman replied, "or as some reports state, the smaller one." In the 1920s, school security was a matter of trust rather than ID cards and locked gates. Holt looked at the young man. He seemed so sincere, so disarming. Sensing a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, Hickman played his ultimate trump card, the bluff of the confident. He leaned in and suggested that if she had any doubts at all, she should immediately pick up the phone and call the bank to verify his story. It was a brilliant, cold-blooded piece of psychological manipulation. By offering to be checked, he made the check feel unnecessary. Holt, moved by the urgency of a dying father's request and the man's apparent honesty, made the fatal decision not to pick up the phone. She sent a runner to Marion's classroom. Imagine 12-year-old Marion Parker sitting at her desk, perhaps daydreaming about her father's birthday dinner that evening when the door opened. She was summoned to the office, likely confused. When she arrived, she saw a stranger and heard the news that shattered her world. Her father was hurt. Her tomboyish spirit, the sensitivity that made her the smaller twin, likely gave way to immediate, frantic concern. She didn't question the man. She trusted the adults in the room. Mary Holt watched as Marion gathered her things and walked out of the school's safe confines. The girl climbed into the passenger seat of a car parked at the curb, either a Hudson or Chrysler. As the engine turned over and the car pulled away from the curb, Marion Parker was leaving the world of the living. She wasn't being taken to a hospital. She was being driven to a modest apartment at the Bellevue Arms, where the Fox had already prepared a nightmare. Back in the classroom, Marjorie Parker sat at her desk, unaware that her sister, the other half of her soul, had just been handed over to a predator. At the bank, Perry Parker was working his usual shift, entirely healthy, perhaps checking the clock and looking forward to seeing his family. The trap had been sprung with terrifying ease, and the city of Los Angeles had no idea that the sun was setting on its era of innocence. As the sun dipped below the horizon on December 15th, 1927, the Parker household at 1631 South Wilton Place was transformed from a place of birthday celebration into a hollowed-out shell of panic. Perry Parker had returned home from the bank, expecting the warm embrace of his family and the laughter of his twins. Instead, he found a house in a state of quiet, vibrating terror. Marjorie was there, but Marion's chair was empty. The realization that Marion had been taken from school under false pretenses rippled through the Los Angeles Police Department. But before the detectives could even begin a traditional canvass, the quote, messenger made his first move. He didn't use a phone. He used the wires. The first telegram arrived that evening, sent from Pasadena. It was short, cold, and calculated to paralyze Perry's every instinct as a father. Do positively nothing till you receive special delivery letter. Marion secure. It was signed with a name Perry didn't recognize, George Fox. But it was the postscript that chilled the blood of the investigators. Marion's own signature was scrawled at the bottom, a jagged proof of life that felt more like a death warrant. But the kidnapper was just warming up. He wasn't just a criminal looking for a payday. He was a narcissist who viewed himself as a mastermind. Over the next 24 hours, the Parker home became the center of a storm of psychological warfare. The letters arrived in quick succession, each more bizarre and threatening than the last. One letter arrived with a heading of Greek letters, Sigma, Delta, Omega, a strange, academic touch for such a visceral crime. The handwriting was a chaotic blend of styles, as if written by a committee of ghosts. In these notes, the kidnapper's persona shifted. He was no longer just George Fox. He was death. He was the Fox. He was fate. The demand was as specific as it was unusual. $1,500 and $20 gold certificates. In 1927, gold certificates were distinct, yellow-backed bills that were increasingly rare. To a banker like Perry, this was a clear signal. The kidnapper wanted currency that was valuable, but he also was choosing something that felt significant, almost ritualistic. Inside those letters, the Fox lectured Perry like a schoolteacher. Be sensible and use good judgment, one note read. You can't deal with a mastermind like a common crook or kidnapper. But the most agonizing part of this all wasn't the demands. It was a botched attempt at a rescue. On the evening of December 16th, the Fox called the house. He gave Perry a location. Perry, desperate and clutching the 75 gold certificates, hurried to his car. But despite the kidnapper's warnings, the LAPD could not help themselves. They were shadowboxing with a phantom, and they decided to tail Perry to the drop-off point. Hickman, watching from the darkness of a nearby alley or parked car, saw it all. He saw the police cruisers lurking blocks away. He saw the not-so-discreet surveillance. He never stepped out. He never made contact. Perry Parker sat in his car for hours, the silence of the night pressing in on him, until he finally realized that his daughter's life had just been gambled, and the house had lost. The fallout was immediate and cruel. The next morning, a new letter arrived, and the tone had shifted from professional to petulant. The fox was angry. "Mr. Parker, I am ashamed of you," he wrote. "You'll never know how disappointed your daughter. You messed the whole damn affair." He accused Perry of collaborating with the authorities and furnishing photos to the press, and then he twisted the knife. He included a second note from Marion. In a shaky, heart-wrenching hand, the 12-year-old pleaded, "Please, Daddy, I want to come home tonight." The tragedy of it is that while Perry was reading those words, while he was begging the police to stay away so he could try one last time, the mastermind had already finished his work. Hickman would later confess that by the time that letter reached the Parker home, Marion was already dead. He had murdered her on the 16th, strangled her with a towel in his bathtub because, quote, her crying was annoying him. The fox was no longer holding a hostage. He was holding a secret. And as he prepared for the final exchange, he began a process so grotesque it would make the nation recoil. He began to, quote, reconstruct Marion for her final performance. While Perry Parker sat in his home, clutching a telephone that refused to ring, the fox was back in his lair. Apartment 315 at the Bellevue Arms was a modest space, but by the night of December 16th, it had become a house of horrors. Hickman was pacing. The police presence at the first drop had insulted him. To Hickman, this wasn't just a crime. It was a demonstration of his intellectual superiority. By involving the LAPD, Perry Parker hadn't just broken a rule. He had challenged the fox's ego. It was in this state of narcissistic rage that the, quote, mastermind made a decision that separates the Marion Parker case from almost any other in the history of American crime. He knew he couldn't return Marion alive, because in a fit of panic and cold irritation over her crying, he had already taken her life. But he still wanted his $1,500. He needed a way to prove she was secure without her ever having to speak a word. What follows is the part of the story that journalists in 1927 struggled to even put into print. Hickman moved to the bathroom. With the clinical detachment of a butcher, he began the process of, quote, reconstructing Marion. He realized that a father would need to see his daughter's face to part with the gold certificates. He needed her to look awake, look present, look alive. He took the torso of the 12-year-old girl and began to dress it. He found a small bedsheet and some of her own clothing to cover the missing limbs. To give the torso the appearance of a living, breathing body, he stuffed the abdominal cavity with rags and a bundle of newspaper. In a stroke of incredible arrogance, or perhaps a subconscious desire to be caught, one of the items he used to fill the void was a towel from the Bellevue Arms, clearly marked with the apartment's name. Then came the most chilling detail. Marion's eyes would not stay open. To solve this, Hickman took thin copper wire and with a terrifying level of focus, stitched her eyelids to her eyebrows. He then applied a heavy layer of makeup, rouge on her pale cheeks and tint on her lips, to mimic the flush of a living child. As the sun began to rise on December 17th, Hickman sat in that small apartment with his creation. He combed her hair. He adjusted her head against the seat of his car. In his mind, he wasn't looking at a mutilated child. He was looking at a ticket to a new life. Back at the Parker home, the psychological torture reached its zenith. A new letter arrived, and this time the fox was no longer playing games. "This is your last chance," the note said. "If you want your daughter, you will come alone. If I see one badge, one flatfoot, one suspicious car, I will leave her in pieces across the city." Harry Parker was a man hollowed out by grief. He begged the police to stay back. He told them that if they followed him again, he would never forgive them. The LAPD, realizing the catastrophic failure of their first was a small bag containing 75 $20 gold certificates, the $1,500 ransom that had become the price of his soul. Perry was a broken man, but in this moment, he was fueled by a desperate, flickering hope. The police were nowhere to be seen. He had made sure of it. He was alone in the darkness, waiting for a predator. At approximately 8 p.m., a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A car, a dark coupe, pulled up alongside Perry's vehicle. Perry's heart hammered against his ribs as a man leaned out of the driver's side window. Most of his face was obscured by a bandana, but his eyes were sharp, glinting with a frantic, nervous energy. In his hand, he leveled a sawed-off shotgun at Perry's chest. "The money," the man hissed. Perry didn't look at the gun. His eyes were locked on the passenger seat of the stranger's car. There, bundled up in a heavy cloak that came right up to her chin, was Marion. Her head was propped against the seat. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead into the night. She didn't blink. She didn't cry out. She didn't even acknowledge her father's presence. "Marion?" Perry called out, his voice cracking. The girl didn't move. In the dim, yellow glow of the street lamps, Perry assumed the worst of his hopes, that she had been drugged, perhaps chloroformed, to keep her quiet during the exchange. He reached out and handed the bag of gold certificates to the man with the bandana. The exchange was instantaneous. As soon as the kidnapper's fingers closed around the money, the atmosphere shifted from tension to a violent, sickening blur of motion. "There's your daughter," the man shouted. With one hand on the steering wheel, the kidnapper reached over and shoved the passenger door open. He pushed the bundled figure of Marion out of the car. She hit the pavement with a heavy, limp thud. Before Perry could even scream, the kidnapper slammed the door, shifted into gear, and the car roared away, tires streaking against the asphalt as he vanished into the LA night. Perry scrambled out of his car and ran to the bundle on the street. He reached down, his hands trembling, to pull his daughter into his arms. He expected the soft warmth of a sleeping child, Instead, he found a nightmare. As he lifted her, the cloak fell away. The illusion Hickman had spent hours crafting in apartment 315 disintegrated in an instant. Perry realized, with a visceral, soul-crushing horror, that the daughter he had just bought back was a hollowed-out shell. There were no arms. There were no legs. As he cradled the torso, he realized she had been disemboweled, her cavity stuffed with rags and a marked towel from the Bellevue Arms. The screams that tore from Perry Parker's throat that night were heard for blocks. They were the sounds of a man who had just seen the absolute floor of human depravity. When the police arrived minutes later, they found a scene that would lead the LA Times to call this, quote, the most horrible crime of the 1920s. The coroner would later determine that Marion had been dead for at least 12 hours before the drop. She had been killed shortly after the first botched ransom drop, her body desecrated to solely satisfy the Fox's greed and ego. The next morning, the horror expanded. A man walking through Elysian Park found several packages wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Inside were Marion's severed arms and legs. The mastermind had discarded them like trash once they were no longer needed for his macabre performance. If LA was a city of contrasts before December 17, 1927, it was a city of singular, white-hot rage afterward. The discovery of Marion's reconstructed remains didn't just break Perry Parker. It broke the heart of the nation. The LAPD, county sheriff, and even the DA mobilized every man they had. It became the largest manhunt in the city's history. A desperate, sprawling search for a man who had proved himself to be a ghost. But even the fox leaves a trail. The breakthrough came from the very arrogance that Hickman used to taunt Perry Parker. The towel found inside Marion's torso bore a laundry mark from the Bellevue Arms apartments. When detectives descended on the building, they found more than just a name. They found a nightmare. Inside apartment 315, they discovered bloody footprints, charred drafts of the ransom notes, and a janitor who recalled seeing a young man, a new tenant named Donald Evans, wiping down the seats of a car with frantic intensity. By December 20th, the mask was gone. Fingerprints lifted from the ransom notes and the abandoned getaway car were matched to William Edward Hickman, a 19-year-old former colleague of Perry Parker. Hickman had been arrested a year prior for forging checks at the very bank where Perry worked. Perry had been the one to report him. The motive wasn't just money. It was a cold, simmering revenge. The fox was on the run, fleeing north in a stolen green Hudson. He moved like a phantom through the Pacific Northwest, paying for gas and clothes in Seattle and Portland with the very gold certificates Perry had handed him. He was spotted at gas stations, his dark blue suit and Oxford shoes a sharp contrast to the desperate nature of his flight. The end came on December 22nd, 1927. In the quiet town of Echo, Oregon, after a frantic 2-mile car chase, Chief of Police Tom Gerdane and Officer Buck Llewellyn forced the green Hudson off the road. When they pulled Hickman from the car, they found $1,400 of the ransom money still in his possession. His first words were a lie. He claimed a, quote, fiend had killed the girl and he was just the messenger. But within hours, the bravado returned. Hickman was extradited back to California, a journey during which he seemed to relish the attention. He smiled for cameras, reading transcripts of his own crimes with a sickening sense of pride. He confessed to the murder, claiming he needed the money to attend a Bible college. He detailed the strangulation and the mutilation with a clinical detachment that horrified even the most seasoned detectives. The trial in February 1928 was a media circus. Hickman's defense team attempted one of the first not guilty by reason of insanity pleas in California history, claiming a supernatural deity named Providence had ordered the killing. But the prosecution dismantled the act, revealing that Hickman had asked fellow inmates how to, quote, act crazy to avoid the noose. The jury took very little time to see through the mastermind facade. On October 19th, 1928, William Edward Hickman walked 13 steps to the gallows at San Quentin. The man who had been so smug in his apartment fainted as the black hood was placed over his head. When the trapdoor dropped, his neck did not break. He spent 2 minutes violently twitching, dying of the very thing he had inflicted on Marion Parker: slow, agonizing asphyxiation. The legacy of the case was permanent. It forced the formal adoption of fingerprinting as a primary investigative tool across the U.S. It changed school security forever. It even caught the attention of a young Ayn Rand who saw in Hickman's rejection of societal norms a dark, distorted version of her own burgeoning philosophies. But for the Parker family, there was no philosophy, only the empty chair at the table and the memory of a 12-year-old girl who had walked out of a school gate and into the pages of a tragedy that a century of time has failed to erase. This podcast is written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. This has been The Evidence Locker. I'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay safe. Join us next week as we open another locker.